In the nation of the aggressor, the budget deficit has grown to an unprecedented and historic 8.5 trillion rubles. That was just last year, but the catastrophe will come in 2026. Already now, at the beginning of the year, in at least 10 regions, teachers are experiencing delays in receiving their class supervision pay, and school administrators are being forced to conduct explanatory work instead of recalculating the money. At the same time, those in Putin's inner circle have not curbed their appetites and continue their theft, accumulating massive fortunes built on blood. We will show who in Russia is profiting greatly from the war and the current deficit budget.
Teachers in Russia are experiencing salary delays. Teachers in 10 regions of the aggressor country have not received their class supervision bonuses.
We're talking about federal bonuses, which amount to 5,000 rubles for teachers in cities with populations over 100,000, and 10,000 rubles for settlements with fewer than 100,000 residents.
In the messages sent to schools, the authorities explained that the Ministry of Education and Science allocated less money than needed for this budget item. They did not specify when the teachers would be paid. Of course, budgets at all levels are severely in deficit. There is no money.
The financial situation is becoming such that it is now impossible to predict or assess it.
In the Kemerovo region, where the budget deficit has reached a record high of 55,700,000,000 rubles, they have started to cancel benefits for the families of occupiers. In the city of Yurga, near a large military training ground, compensation for kindergartens for such families was cut from 100% to 25%. Now parents have to pay themselves, and the full benefit is only kept for families of those killed in action or missing in action. An official source in the regional government has reported that this could potentially spread to other districts depending on the deficits in local budgets. Thus, in Russia, which unleashed a bloody war against Ukraine, financial and budgetary problems are rapidly snowballing out of control. The scale of this budgetary catastrophe is enormous by the end of 2025.
Let me remind you that the regions are currently facing a huge budget deficit. We often talk about the federal budget, about the 5 or 6 trillion ruble hole there is collapsing. And for the regions, it's a complete disaster. If last year you and I discussed this, and my forecast seemed grim, that the deficit would be 800 billion rubles, maybe 1 trillion rubles, in reality, the deficit of the regional budgets of the Federation's subjects exceeded 1.5 trillion rubles, although the Ministry of Finance had budgeted no more than 340 billion.
The deficit of the Pension and Social Insurance Fund at the end of 2025 exceeded 1 trillion rubles. Another 80 billion rubles of deficit was added to the overall deficit of the entire budgetary system of the Russian Federation by the Mandatory Medical Insurance Fund. So let's add up all the numbers. The federal budget deficit, the regional budget deficits, 1.5 trillion, let me remind you, the deficits of the pension, social, medical funds, and so on and so on. When we add it all up, it comes to 8.3 trillion rubles, an enormous figure, over $100 billion. That's how much Russia fell short for all its wishes in 2025.
This is 2.6 times greater than what we saw in the entire previous year, even though the figure for 2024 was already a record high. But it's quite likely that these devastating numbers for the economy have been falsified and seriously embellished.
Putin met with the head of the Federal Agency for State Property Management, Yakovenko, and he reported that in 2025, his agency ensured the budget received dividends from all state-owned companies, with state participation totaling 521 billion rubles. Did you catch that? And in December 2025, when the Ministry of Finance was reporting on the deficit, they stated that they had received 1.1 trillion in such dividends from companies with state participation. In other words, the Ministry of Finance inflated the dividend revenues by 500 billion. That's pure fabrication, just to reduce the deficit. And I think they did the same with other items as well. In reality, the deficit was even larger than what Klyukin calculated. He used official Ministry of Finance data. And if you consider that this data is already fake, then the deficit was probably even bigger.
The Kremlin's statistics are fake across the board. And most importantly, of course, when it comes to military spending. Germany's Federal Intelligence Service has learned that Russia is spending significantly more on the war, 66% more, than it officially claims. In 2025, military expenditures accounted for about half of the total budget. Putin is allocating more and more money to the war, while revenues to the Russian budget are falling due to anti-war sanctions and the general trend in the oil market. Oil and gas revenues have collapsed. In the year 2025, they fell by 24%. And then in January 2026, they dropped by 50%.
Government budget revenues are continuously shrinking, and the overall incomes of oil companies are also falling. In Russia, due to the collapse in oil prices and reduced export volumes, oil company bankruptcies have begun. Rostoil is a company operating in the Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Okrug, producing 500,000 tons per year. Also, at the end of 2025, the company Yanfor entered bankruptcy proceedings. Astrakhan Oil Company went bankrupt, as did the oil company Gorny.
While teachers and the families of the occupiers wait for pennies, officials are stealing billions. And this is yet another huge item of budget expenditure and losses. In the Russian Ministry of Defense, theft of 2 billion rubles was uncovered in the supply of clothing products at inflated prices. An organized group was embezzling money through government contracts. In 2025, at least 15 vice governors were detained on corruption charges. This is a record for the past 10 years.
If this corruption tax and burden on the economy did not exist, the effective use of these resources would also help reduce the budget deficit, for example, and ease inflationary pressure. But corruption takes away a huge amount of resources in the country. There are various estimates as to how many dozens of % of GDP are eaten up by the corruption tax.
Political analysts say the system is devouring itself. This is for the better. Corruption accelerates the depletion of the budget. The faster the money runs out, the sooner the aggressor will run out of resources for war, and it may come to an end. But for now, the population of the Russian Federation is paying for both the villas of the Putinists and the war. But no matter how much Putin tightens the tax screws, delays teachers' salaries, or cuts social programs, the Kremlin will not be able to cover the budget deficit in 2026.
When a country runs out of the money it needs to live on, it faces a troubled and uncertain future. Russia currently faces two threats, in fact. The first threat is the steadily increasing deficit. Right now, absolutely nobody can accurately predict what the actual deficit in Russia will be this year. Well, quite literally no one at all, because it's clear that the process is completely unmanageable and uncontrollable.
This year, the deficit will be several times worse than what the Ministry of Finance projected. Not 3.8 trillion, but 8 or even 10 trillion rubles.
International war criminals, the entire Russian government is searching for money through new levies. But this will only worsen the decline in budget revenues because businesses are shutting down, the population is getting poorer, and the war continues draining all resources. As a result, the budget deficit is growing, deepening into an abyss where the economic bottom will inevitably turn into a crushing defeat for the Russian Federation, crushed by the weight of its own aggression and isolation.